What's going on, everybody? I'm Johnny Brook. Welcome back to another Craft Workshop video, and welcome to my laundry room. So in this video, I'm going to show you how I pulled up the crappy vinyl floor that was in here and replaced it with this brand new tile flooring from Lowe's, who is the sponsor of this week's video. And this was my first time ever doing tile. So originally this video was going to be part of my laundry room makeover, but I decided to split them up because there's just so much information, I think, especially for people who are new to tile. I did a ton of research. I still made plenty of mistakes, and I really tried to tailor the information in this video for people who are new to tile work. So hopefully it's helpful, hopefully you enjoyed the video, and let's go ahead and get started with the project. Our laundry room was one of the spaces that was the most dated when we moved into our new house. It had crappy looking vinyl flooring, wire shelving, poor lighting, and even the carpet directly outside of the laundry room didn't match the rest of the carpet in the hallway. All that to say, my wife and I definitely wanted to make some changes to this laundry room area. So the first step in this project, as with any other room makeover, was to get everything out of the room. I picked out a new washer and dryer from Lowe's, and when the new units were delivered, I had the delivery guys leave the new units in the hallway outside of the laundry room so that I could work on the floor. Next, I vacuumed up all of the lint and other crap off of the flooring, and then I could get started removing it. And I thought this would be a super easy task, but boy was I wrong. So first, I removed the quarter round by scoring the caulk between the quarter round and baseboard, and then prying it off with a pry bar. And I was planning to replace this anyway, so I wasn't particularly careful here. So just a tip, after removing anything with nails in it, like this quarter round, I make sure to flatten all of the nails so that I don't inadvertently stab myself later in the project, or when I'm throwing all this stuff away later. And as you can see, the vinyl flooring actually started to peel back as I was removing part of the quarter round, so I thought I was in the clear, but then I saw more vinyl flooring underneath it, and we'll get to that in a second.
What?
Oh, no.
Anyway, with the trim removed, I went to remove the transition between the vinyl and carpet, and quickly realized that this transition strip was permanently attached to the carpet. Well, as I mentioned, this section of carpet was mismatched anyway, so I decided to just go ahead and rip it out. And this hallway will be getting hardwood flooring at some point, so that wasn't a huge deal. I cut the ends of this section of carpet, pulling it back from the tack strip, and then rolled it up and removed it. And I repeated the process for the carpet pad, and then I could remove the tack strips. And the key when removing tack strips is to pry up on the nails holding them down, so that the tack strips don't break into a bunch of pieces. This way you can remove the strips all in one piece, and it goes much quicker. With the carpet out of the way, I could finally go about removing the flooring from the laundry room, and unfortunately, as I mentioned, there was another layer of flooring beneath that top layer. And it looks like the previous owner had damaged the floor and just decided to cover it up rather than try and fix it. No worries, I figured removing the bottom layer of flooring would be easy enough, but that was not really the case. So for some reason, this vinyl flooring had been adhered to an 1/8 inch layer of plywood, and that was attached to the subfloor with hundreds of narrow crown staples. And I still don't understand why they didn't attach the flooring directly to the subfloor, but removing the plywood and vinyl itself was pretty straightforward once I got a larger pry bar. Removing the staples, on the other hand, was a royal pain. And I know there are scrapers out there that might have been able to remove some of these, but these staples were not your typical carpet pad staples. These were over 1 inch long, narrow crown staples like cabinet shops use for drawer box assembly. The best tool I found for removing these things was a pair of diagonal pliers, and they were able to grip onto the heads of the staples, and then I could just use leverage to pry the staples out. If I tried to just brute force the staples with vice grips, I ended up working a heck of a lot harder. I also might have been able to pound the staples flush with a hammer, but I knew I was going to have to sand down some high spots, and I really didn't want to be burning through sanding belts and sending sparks flying all over the place.
Here we go. Ready?
Anyway, after getting all of those staples removed, I wanted to have a little bit of fun. So I decided to try cleaning out our dryer vent using a method I had seen online, an electric leaf blower. And this worked surprisingly well.
Oh, look!
After cleaning out the dryer vent, I could check the subfloor for any high spots, and as I expected, there was a pretty decent hump right at the front of the room. I marked the high spots and then went at them with a belt sander. And getting your subfloor flat is especially important with large format tiles like the ones I used, since an uneven subfloor will tend to cause lippage or unevenness between the edges of the tiles. Once the subfloor was reasonably flat, I could move on to the actual tile work. And first I needed to prep the subfloor for tile, and you don't want to lay tile directly on an OSB subfloor, as the OSB will expand and contract at a different rate than the tile and you'll end up with cracking. To deal with this, you need to cover the subfloor with either cement board or use an uncoupling membrane, which is what I went with. This orange plastic sheeting called Ditra is made by Schluter and is available in these smaller rolls that are great for a smaller space like this one. And the purpose of this product is to uncouple your tile from the subfloor, which allows the subfloor, whether that's concrete or wood, to expand and contract while allowing the tile to stay put, which reduces cracking. Anyway, to install this Schluter Ditra, I first needed to cut a few sections the size to fit in the space, and since this stuff is plastic, it cuts easily with a utility knife or scissors. Once I had the pieces fit, I could go ahead and start dry fitting the tile. And for this project, I went with this really nice looking 12 by 24 inch large format tile from the Mohawk Forever style line from Lowe's. And this tile is waterproof, stain proof, and scratch resistant, so it's great for high traffic areas. And Mohawk uses a proprietary wear guard glaze to give it this added durability. It also comes in a bunch of different styles that you can mix and match, but this gray marble pattern was my favorite and looks pretty awesome in my opinion. So the first step in dry fitting the tile was to figure out how much I was going to need to rip off the first row of tile, and as it turned out, these tiles fit almost perfectly in this space. So I added the tiles with a 3/16 inch spacer, which is the gap I was leaving for the grout, between each of them as well as between the first tile and the wall. And luckily I only needed to remove about 7/8 of an inch from the first row to have the tile end where I wanted it. Next, I removed the Ditra temporarily so that I could mark out the center point of the room as well as the offset I was going with. And on a larger room, you would mark these lines with a chalk line and also install your tile from the center of the room, but honestly on a room this small, it was easier to just mark my lines with permanent marker and install them starting in the back of the room. Also, on large format tile like this, you don't want an offset greater than 33%, otherwise you'll end up with more lippage. And that means your typical brick pattern with a 50% offset will not really work with large format tile. I went with a 6-inch offset, which worked out to about 25%, and I think this looked great and also meant I ended up with very little tile waste. With my offset laid out, I could start marking tiles to be cut. And if you watch my laminate and vinyl flooring install videos, this is essentially the same process. To mark where to cut, I would flip the tiles around 180 degrees, place a set of spacers between the wall and the tile, and then use another spacer at the end I would be cutting to know where to mark my line. And this would just ensure that I'd have the correct gap on both sides of the tile once it was cut. I marked the tiles at each end of this first row and then headed downstairs to make my cuts. And I used a tile saw here, but honestly a manual snap cutter would have worked fine for about 90% of the cuts on this project. It would have also meant that I could have made these cuts inside rather than having to bring the tile downstairs through a gauntlet of 3 different baby gates. Anyway, I first cut the 2 tiles on the ends to length, and then I ripped all 4 of the tiles in this first row to width. After making my cuts, I could go back and fit the tiles, and somehow I mismarked one of the tiles, so I had to trim off a little sliver, and then I could finally dry fit that first row. With the first row in, I could just continue repeating the same process on the next 2 rows, adding spacers, marking for my cut, making my cuts, and then dry fitting the tiles. When I got to the last row, I needed to undercut the door jamb and trim before I could get the tile fit. To do this, I took a scrap piece of Ditra and a tile and used that as a guide for my oscillating tool. And in retrospect, I should have added more space here to account for the thin set, as I ran into some issues with this gap being too tight later on. And I think a second layer of Ditra would have done the trick here. Once the door jamb was undercut, I marked where I needed to notch out the tile, making sure the cut edges would end up under the jamb and trim, and then made the cut with the tile saw. And these notch cuts are really where the tile saw came in handy, and if you don't own a tile saw, you could also just rent one for a project like this. Finally, with the last 2 tiles dry fit, all of my cuts were done, and the floor was looking really good. The last thing to cut before the actual tile install was this transition strip, which is called a Schluter strip. And this gives the tile a nice finished edge, and since it's aluminum, cuts really easily with a standard miter saw. Before removing all the tiles, I labeled them with some painter's tape and permanent marker so that I could easily put them back in the right spot when it came time to install the tile. I also vacuumed the subfloor again just to make sure nothing was going to interfere with the tile. With that, I can move on to actually laying the tile, which was something I was honestly pretty nervous about. To help me get the thin set consistency right, I decided to go with this thin set mortar system from Map-I, which I picked up at Lowe's, and it clearly outlines the liquid to powder ratio. So in this case, I was using this polymer additive as my liquid rather than water, as it helps the thin set bond to the subfloor better. So I used the entire 2-gallon container, and then I used this uncoupling membrane mortar, which again called for the entire bag to be used. And this made the mixing math really easy, but also meant I had a very full bucket. And that first stir with the paddle made a bit of a mess. Anyway, I mixed the thin set for a few minutes, making sure everything was nicely incorporated, and then let the thin set sit for about 5 minutes. And this rest period gives the thin set time to absorb the moisture and smooth out, and this is called slaking and is extremely important. So after slaking for 5 minutes, I mixed the thin set again, and then it was ready to use. That was, of course, after bringing this 60-pound bucket of thin set upstairs. Before applying the thin set, I wiped down my subfloor with a damp sponge, and this both cleans any remaining dust off of the subfloor, but also wets it slightly, just to ensure the subfloor doesn't suck up too much moisture out of the thin set. And you might be thinking, but what about the uncoupling membrane? I thought we couldn't attach the tile directly to the subfloor. And that is correct. This first layer of thin set is to adhere the membrane itself to the subfloor, not the tile. And as you can see, as I laid the thin set, I really tried to work it into the subfloor to make sure I ended up with a good bond. After working in the thin set, I added a slightly thicker layer and then used the notch side of my trowel to comb the thin set. And this Schluter system requires one of a few specific notch patterns, so just make sure to follow the directions there. Looking back at this, I probably needed a slightly thicker layer of thin set, but again, this was my first time ever laying down mortar. With the thin set in place, I could add the first piece of the membrane. I laid it in place and then worked the membrane into the thin set with a rubber grout float. This membrane has a fleece backing that bonds with the thin set, and it's extremely important that it's worked into the thin set well. After going over the membrane with my grout float, I peeled back an edge to see how even the coverage was, and I could see that I had some bare spots around the edges especially. So I went back and added more thin set and then just repeated that same process, and you can see that the front edge was peeling back when I didn't have enough thin set, but stayed flat once I added more. After finishing the first section, I repeated the same process for the other section, which went a little bit smoother since I was getting more comfortable with the trowel. Once the second section was in place, I removed any excess thin set and then I could start laying the tile. And this was essentially more of the same process, except that I needed to use a different trowel with a bigger notch pattern since I was using large format tiles. And the notches in the thin set allow the air to escape from beneath the tiles, and these larger notches give that air more room to escape with the larger tiles. Also, the notches should be running perpendicular to the longest edge of the tile, again to allow that air to escape. You don't want to have your notches running in different directions, and especially not in a swirling pattern, as air will get trapped, the tile won't bond properly, and you'll end up with weak tiles. One other thing I needed to do here was fill in that waffle pattern on the membrane to make sure there was enough thin set so that the tiles bonded well. When spreading the thin set, I would only work in sections that I could get tile onto within about 15 minutes, as I didn't want the thin set setting up before I could get the tile set in place. Setting the tile was easy. I just put the tile in place, wiggled the tile side to side, which collapses those notches and really bonds that tile with the thin set, and then I added spacers around the tile to keep it from moving around when I added the next tile. One other thing I probably should have done was what's called back buttering, where you spread a thin layer of thin set on the back of the tile before placing it. And this is especially important on large format tiles so that you get even coverage, and it's something I honestly just completely forgot to do. So I just kept working my way down the line, adding more tiles and spacers until I got to the last row, which is where I ran into a little bit of trouble. So as I mentioned earlier, I didn't quite undercut that door jamb and trim enough, and this made sliding the tiles into place under the trim extremely difficult. And the left side went in okay, but the right side just wouldn't go all the way in without some assistance. And I had the bright idea to use a hammer using some of the Ditra as padding, and surprise, surprise, I ended up cracking the tile. So after having a mild panic attack, I had to recut the tile on the fly while the thin set was setting up, and this made for a pretty stressful moment. Luckily, I was able to get the tile cut quickly and actually got it in place with just a little bit of persuasion, and then I could place that last tile. And before I did that, I also needed to add that transition strip, which I should have done before laying the last row of tile. And the strip goes between the tile and the membrane and is held in place by the thin set. Once the strip was in place, I could lay the last tile, also refreshing that thin set. And you can see that there was a little bit of lippage between that tile below the trim and the center tile. And this was again because the trim was pushing down on the tile, causing it to lift slightly. And I didn't feel like there was much I could do at this point, so I just left it alone. After setting that last tile and breathing a sigh of relief, I cleaned up any excess thin set from the subfloor, between the tiles, and on the baseboards, and then I let it set up for about 24 hours. The next day, I removed all the spacers and painter's tape, as well as any thin set that I might have missed, and I found that the scouring pad on a kitchen sponge did a really great job here, as well as a putty knife for any bits between the tiles. The next step in the tile process was grouting, which really gives the tile a finished look. I went with this pre-mixed grout, another Map-I product from Lowe's, and the nice thing is that it doesn't need to be sealed afterwards since it already has a sealer mixed in. Adding the grout was a pretty simple process. First, I wiped down a section with a damp sponge to make sure no other debris was on the surface of the tile, and then I started working the grout into the seams between the tiles. And you really want to work the grout in to make sure the joints are completely filled with grout, otherwise it might end up settling as it dries and leaving you with voids. After working the grout into the joints, I scraped across the tile at a 45-degree angle from the grout lines to remove the excess grout. After scraping off the excess, I gave the grout 5 to 10 minutes to set up before cleaning the rest off with a sponge, and I actually grouted about 3/4 of the entire floor before going back with the sponge. And I think this ended up being a little bit too long, as the grout was kind of difficult to remove with the sponge. In retrospect, I probably would have only done about half the floor at a time. Once again, when removing the grout with the sponge, I wiped across the face of the tile at a 45-degree angle to the grout lines, and I didn't really need to use a ton of pressure here. Also, my sponge was damp but not dripping wet, and if you add too much water, it'll have the tendency to lift the color from the grout. I just continued working my way around the floor, removing the excess grout, and also added the grout to the last section, as well as in the gap the transition strip has built in, and then I could let the grout set up for another 24 hours. As I mentioned, I think I let the grout set up for a little bit too long before wiping it off, so I was left with some bits of excess grout on the surface of the tiles, along with a little bit of haze, and I think this is pretty typical. To remove the haze, I used this tile cleaner, and I poured it on and spread it around with a sponge, let it sit for a few minutes, and then came back and scrubbed any problem areas with the scouring pad on the sponge. After scrubbing, I went over the entire floor with my grout sponge to remove any excess cleaner, and then dried off the floor with a towel.
Alright, hopefully you guys enjoyed this one. I am pretty happy with the way this floor came together. It's not perfect by any means, but I think it looks really great still, and honestly most of it's going to be covered up by those laundry machines. Again, hopefully you guys enjoyed this one. If you aren't already, go ahead and get subscribed. I put out new project videos like this pretty much every week. I'll be putting out the second part of this laundry room makeover video later this week, probably on Sunday, so stay tuned for that. Also ring that little notification bell so you don't miss my future videos. I'll have links to all of the tools and materials I use down in the video description below, including this beautiful Mohawk Forever style tile from Lowe's. And last, I want to say a big shout out to my YouTube members. If you guys want to support me, you can go check that out as well. All right, thanks for watching everybody, and until next week, happy building. Ugh.